Good morning, guys. This is chapter 10 of The River Between Us, pages 105 through 111. The Illinois Central locomotive made straight for us. At the sight of that one-eyed iron thing, I'd have run across plowed ground if I wasn't afraid it would follow me. It lumbered into the station at Carbondale and shook the world. Live steam shots at our skirt tails, and the sound was deafening. Delphine was naturally unfazed. While we waited in the depot, she sent a message by telegraph to Cairo in hopes it would find Dr. Hutchins for whatever good he might do. It send word by a wire was well beyond my imaginings. At the platform, the engine seemed to claw the ground like a living thing. Delphine directed our trunks into the baggage car. The train was a long one, crammed with military supplies. We were handed up into the only chair car. It was nearly full of men stirring from their sleep for a look at Delphine behind her veils. Two of them gave up their seats for us. With a sickening lurch, we pulled out of the station and gathered speed. I kept the hamper with me in case we were hungry on the train, but I left my stomach at Carbondale. I never moved this fast, and it was like a dream of flying. The hills and hollers of southern Illinois blurred past the window, red and yellow under the autumn sun. I learned now a purpose for the veils Delphine tacked to her hats. Soot and ash blew continually through the open window. My veil plastered against my nose with every breath I drew. Delphine's veil, with dots that gave her beauty marks, hung in a graceful swag, caught up at the corsage of cloth flowers on her shoulder. She could have been any age behind her veil, beneath the dip of her hat brim. I sat opposite of her, yearning for one crumb of her confidence because I needed it now. The two men in officer uniforms sitting behind us got up to smoke their cheroots at the end of the car. I asked her then what I'd never imagined to ask before. Delphine, how old are you? Me? Her eyebrows flew up behind the spotted veil. I wondered if she'd tell me, but she shrugged and said, 15. I nearly fainted and fell back in a chair surprise. 16 at Christmas. Kalinda is 17. Never. Why, you're younger than me. Only months, but I'd been looking up to her this whole time. She shrugged again. For me, it's not young. She drew a gloved hand from her muff and pointed to herself. Much should have been decided for me by now, my future made certain. You don't mean married? Married, she turned the word over like it was a new one to her. Then she jammed both fists back into her muff where she kept the money for our journey. We don't marry. Not as you know it. The men came back to their seats, and she looked away out the window to discourage them if they tried to speak to us. I did the same, wondering what I'd heard her say, wondering if I'd heard her right. We smelled Cairo before we saw the place. It was the end of the line. In better times, this train ran all the way to New Orleans to connect the ships to Panama. All the mob milling on the platform outside looked like the rough customers. I was too scared to stir, but Delphine turned to the two officers beside us. You'll be good enough to help us with our trunks, she said, like it was the least they could do. They fell over themselves to hand her down onto the platform, and me too, since I wouldn't turn loose of her. I was occupied then in keeping skirts off the filthy platform. It was littered with bustled boxes and crates broken with their labels gone. Food of every kind rotted on the ground, broken crocks of fruit and splintered jars of jam, cured hams crusted with flies, loaves of bread frosted with mold. It was the provisions families had tried to send their soldier son, but poorly packed and too long in the journey. The combination of smells cut my eyes, but worse smells were on the way. The crowd parted, and there, like a knight in armor, was Dr. Hutchinson's, lifting his hat to us. He found our message when he come to the telegraph office to wire for supplies. And yes, there was a place where we could stay, though the town was bursting at the seams. They wanted 2 prices for everything. Oh, it was good to see him, though he looked tired to death. He'd slept in them clothes. Still, he's younger than I remembered. He had a trap pulled by a piebald pony, tied up by the platform. The officers swung our trunks up onto the back of the trap and melted away once they saw a gentleman had met us. I made sure Delphine was up on the board beside the doctor to reward him for coming to find us. When I'd hunkered among the boxes behind, we set off through the streets down in mud and worse. Cairo crouched in a swamp under the levees that held back both rivers, the Ohio and the Mississippi. I couldn't have pictured a town this big. The endless rows of houses, one right around the other, crowded me. Long trains of army wagons dragged by mules clogged the streets and slowed our way. The filth of the place was beyond anything you ever seen. Along all the mud streets stood water in the ditches, abuzz with blue bottles and mosquitoes, as there hadn't been a frost yet this far south. The whole town was a dump. The swollen carcasses of dogs lay about, and even a dead horse half in a cut of water, red with its blood. I clutched the hamper to me and tried to cover my nose. It was a terrible place, this Cairo, right down there at the end of Illinois, at the end of the world. People swarmed wherever you looked, men mainly of every age. Most were in uniform or parts of uniform. Some went about their business, but more of them were drunk, reeling drunk, fighting drunk, and sleeping it off with their boots in the ditches and their heads cradled in filth. They train on the parade grounds all morning, the doctor said, but nobody can decide what to do with them the rest of the day, the able-bodied. The ruts turned us onto another street where the houses were bigger. Dr. Hutchinson drove up the lane of a quiet, fine place, finer than any in Grand Tower. He had a room there, from a widow woman, a Miss Hanran. She's a Southern lady, he said, indeed a Southern sympathizer, I gather. This may have been for Delphine's benefit. She'd seen nothing welcoming in this town so far. Dr. Hutchinson said Miss Hanran had a full house, but there was a summer kitchen around back where we could sleep. She'd have her handyman set up a bed for us out there by nightfall. But what did I care where I slept? I was here to find my brother. I plagued Dr. Hutchinson's about him before he'd seen me down from the trap. He'd pulled on his beard when he told me about Noah. Yes, he was in one of the 31st Regiment hospitals. He's over the worst, the doctor said, with any luck. And it wasn't measles. It was dysentery, according to the doctor, who was too refined and scientific to say trots. The summer kitchen was a little black shuttered one, shanty overgrown with brilliant sumac. An iron range stood inside, the first kitchen stove I had ever set my eyes on. When we threw open the trunks, the doctor brightened out the sight of Calinda's cures, the horehound, and the lobia, and the Jimson weed painkiller. They seemed to be short of everything. We folded what we could carry in a quilt, and I was ready to set off. But Dr. Hutchinson thought we ought to pin up our skirts before the campgrounds were a quagmire. He was a little shy of the female sex, for he looked away when he spoke of our skirts and the heels on Delphine's slippers. He stood out on the porch, examining the sumac, while we made these adjustments. What a sight I'd have been. My brown stripped calico was hitched up to show my broken boots, but I wore my hat and veils elegant, because Delphine had seen to them. There was a full bird on the wing, stuffed and about to take off from my hat brim. I knew there was because of the picture we had taken later. Delphine seemed to think I dropped to my knees and laced up her flat-heeled boots. I wouldn't, because once you started waiting on her, there was no end to it. I became this close to telling her I wasn't her slave, but thought better of it. Battling at her veils, she managed to bend over and lace up her own boots without sighing and grunting on account of her corsets. Then we were ready with some afternoon left. Off we went through the terrible Cairo streets, making for Noah. They'd pitched Camp Defiance out on the point where the Ohio River runs into the muddy Mississippi. The great earthworks that held back the rivers were the fortress walls. Cannons bristled on top. Some were trained at the Kentucky, some across at Missouri, some rebel country both ways. The front gate was only an opening in a rail stockade defense. The families of soldiers crowded around inside, waiting for them. But Dr. Hutchinson's had passes into the camp for us, though we were to be off the post before they fired the sunset gun. It was a tent city inside, row on row of white tents, closed at teeth. The first ones were raised over wooden floors. Those were where the officers were quartered, and will I ever forget the first real sight there was to see. And that was chapter 10 of The River Between Us from page, I think it was 103 to 111.